first, you're more curious to hear what Hans Ulrich has to say. Um, Hans Ulrich, how are you today? Okay. Can you see it? Yes, very good. Oops, he's talking. Don't talk yet, Hans Ulrich. Wait a second. That's good, I can control Hans Ulrich now. So yes, we had a meeting. As you know, like Hans Ulrich, Édouard Glissant is super important for Hans Ulrich. He's done several events. He has that immense archive. He was collecting. He did his own interviews with Édouard Glissant. He also collected other presentations and appearances on TV, etc. And yeah, the beginning of this discussion, there's a little bit of an anecdote that Hans Ulrich is telling, because I found out from Asad Raza that he prepares very intensively for every kind of event that he does. And so he was meeting me for the first time, and so he read up about me, and he found out that I did a project on Willem Flusser, who's a Czechoslovakian thinker of technology, and also of communication and of communications technologies. And he wrote a lot about writing, and for Glissant and for Hans Ulrich, writing is a very interesting element itself. And you know that here in West we have a special room, the Alphabetum, where you started off today, which is dedicated to the forms of letters and to writing, formally writing, beyond what is expressed in the writing. So at the beginning, he's going to be talking a little bit about Flusser and the relation of Flusser, bringing it into Glissant. And so that's a little introduction to our discussion. That's why he starts talking about Willem Flusser. Let's see if it all makes sense, and I'll stop it. And the idea was that we're going to stop the video from time to time and discuss it. So, I mean, if Asad's not here, then I'll just stop it when I feel like it. And then we can discuss it. Hopefully you have something you want to discuss too. Here we go. Hopefully it's good. Full screen.
Kind of leading up right away into Glissant, because I've always been interested in this idea of how we can bring in thinkers into curation and into exhibition, and that's how I, at a certain moment, also, reached out to Bruno Latour when he had written "We Have Never Been Modern," and it led to us with Barbara Fadolin doing Laboratorium with him, and then him doing lots of shows at ZKM, and in a similar kind of way. Even earlier, at the very beginning of the 90s, I reached out to Willem Flusser because I thought that, in a similar way that Lyotard would have done Les Immatériaux.
Can everybody understand? Is it like, yeah? It also sounds difficult for me. Maybe we can, I don't know what we can do. Can we, roll off the low frequencies a bit, just EQ it a bit thinner so that it's, just play with the EQ a bit so that it's a little bit clearer. Yeah. So he was talking about this is really interesting for me and also for Hans Ulrich, for examples, that how to connect the work of thinkers in the contemporary art space, and that we've both done quite a few projects with that. So the concretization, the synthesis of thinking, the aestheticization of thinking.
That the Louvre had done this exhibition where they would invite Derrida, or they would invite Julia Kristeva, or as a matter of fact, Umberto Eco, to actually curate exhibitions. It could be interesting with Flusser to think with him about what that medium of the exhibition sort of would mean. And he was in residency at the Schloss Solitude, of all places, in Stuttgart. He answered immediately when I wrote to him, because basically what happened is that my friends Fischli Weiss, Peter Fischli and David Weiss, were very inspired by his books. And I had written to him that we would like to visit. And, Peter and David said he's probably not going to answer because we don't know him. I said, no, we are definitely going to make this happen. And so one Monday morning early, we drove with Peter and David in their car from Zurich to Stuttgart to meet Wilhelm Flusser. And I have this unpublished manuscript, which maybe the Flusser archive should have, because it's kind of interesting, as it's never been published. And the reason why it's never been published is because basically the main purpose of the interview did not really work out, because what we wanted is that we wanted him to kind of react to photography and show him Fischli Weiss's photography and have a conversation about that. And it was also somehow we were interested in connecting it to Bourdieu's kind of illegitimate art, and make a connection, sort of Bourdieu, Flusser, etc., etc. But that didn't really work out, because it's sort of what he said about the photos of Fischli Weiss and the way he reacted. It was not, particularly productive. But the conversation included something else, which actually for me was life changing, because he explained to us that we basically need to always acknowledge that when we use technology, that we should use it in a way that the inventors have not thought of, and almost like, to do with the camera what the person who has invented the camera would have never thought you could do with the camera. And of course, I immediately said, this is kind of reminds me of the situation. This is almost like a détournement. So, and later on, I was always, when I got a new device or a new app, I would always think about Flusser. And so when in 2000, I think 12 or 13, the artist Ryan Tricati, we were in Los Angeles with Bettina Korek and actually Kevin McGarry, and they took me to the studio of Ryan Tricati. And Ryan Tricati immediately downloaded the app of Instagram, the then newly invented app of the Instagram, which Kevin Systrom and Mike Kruger had invented on my phone. And he was a very early adopter of Instagram. And that means he had, I don't remember, 10,000 followers really early on, which was a lot, given the fact that not so many people at that time used the app. And so he immediately sent a message to all his followers, Hans Ulrich has joined Instagram. And so I was somehow thrown into the water and had to somehow swim. Or to phrase it differently, I was put under enormous peer pressure, because wherever I went, people said, "Oh, Hans Ulrich, you've joined Instagram, but you're not posting. You're not posting what's going on." And I knew that I wouldn't want to post selfies. I knew that no one would be interested in seeing my food. All these sort of existing tropes, or however you call them, which started all these sort of existing ways of Instagram. They were not. So I knew what I didn't want to do. They were not for me. I knew also that it needed to have a mission of some sort. That it needed to have a purpose, a mission, a utility. And then I went to see Umberto Eco in Milan, because I was asked to interview him for an archive project. I was in his apartment in Rome, and it was almost, being in his book, the Name della Rosa, the name of the rose, because basically he had a key to a secret room. And towards the end of our meeting, he took out this very big key and he opened the secret room in the apartment. Already the apartment blew me away, because it had bookshelves for almost every book he had ever written until the very end. The Cemetery of Prague was there, and there was a whole bookshelf where he had shown all his research. But he said what he really wanted to show me is this secret room. So we entered the secret room. He locked it behind himself. He says no one besides him ever gets access to this room. So at this moment I started, it was really like in the name of the rose, and there was the room was full of medieval books, of basically manuscripts. And we started to have a conversation on handwriting. And Umberto Eco says, he's very deeply concerned about the disappearance of handwriting. And that basically, and that was somehow the farewell gift he gave me, because often artists are giving me tasks. And that will then bring us also to Glissant, because Glissant also gave us a task. Boetti gave me a task early on when I went to see him in Rome, and that connects to Glissant, because it was actually Boetti who was the first person who told me about Édouard Glissant. And he gave me the task, Boetti, to talk basically to artists about their unrealized projects and then make them happen. Rosemarie Trockel gave me a task to not only visit young artists or artists of my generation, but to also visit artists of previous generations who might have been, who might not have the visibility they deserve. So artists, always, I don't know why, they sort of gave me tasks, and I very often then these tasks became projects. And so Eco gave me a rather major task. He basically said, it's for your generation and people like you to save handwriting. I'm too old. And I remember I was sort of slightly dizzy. I left the apartment of Echo and I thought like, wow, I mean, I'm not qualified to do that. I'm not the calligrapher. I certainly won't found a calligraphy school. And then, I sort of took the train and I think I went to Rome and I didn't forget about it, but I somehow had to park the idea because it was very overwhelming. And then basically, every couple of days, I would sort of think echo handwriting, but I didn't have an idea. Then I was in Los Angeles for this mentioned visit with Ryan Tricartin, and before, and I already had the sort of app of Instagram, but the two things didn't connect. It was like two separate problems. I had a problem how to actually, what would I do with Instagram? There was peer pressure, and then I had a problem. What do I do with handwriting given to me by Umberto Eco? There was no peer pressure there because the world didn't know about it, but I knew about it. And it was sort of pesant. It was kind of heavy on me. And I said, I kind of owe him an answer. Because he also said, write to me your ideas of how you're going to save handwriting. Write to me, write to us. Every day I was thinking, what am I going to write to Umberto Eco? Then, towards the end of the year, we were with my partner Koujonga, the artist in Bretagne, in Brittany. And as Asad knows from our numerous visits together in Brittany, because actually we had a lot of preparations and research for our Glissant project in Brittany. It rains a lot in Brittany and Bretagne, particularly at Christmas time. The weather, I mean, I'm telling you, it's ghastly. So it was raining, and then there was a little bit of a window, and we went on a walk. And Kouchonga and I were there with the poet and artist Etel Adnan, and the late Etel Adnan and Simon Fatal. And we were on a wonderful walk, and all of a sudden the rain became heavy again, so we had to find shelter in the way in a cafe. And as it happens, the rain just would not stop. An hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and we had a very beautiful conversation about art and poetry. But then, at a certain moment, the inevitable happened, as you can imagine. Simon, after about 3 hours, Ku and I would go on our phones, and would start to answer a few emails and text messages. And above all, we would announce to our next meetings that we would run late, right? Or we had a couple of phone calls, or, it was pre-Zoom, not Zoom, so phone calls, so we had to postpone them. And of course, Etel did not have a smartphone. So Etel took out her little notebook and started to write a poem. And that's when all of a sudden, in a sort of a very instantaneous way, it all came together. I thought, echo, handwriting, because of course of her handwriting. I thought, oh, and I have this issue with Instagram. And then I suddenly thought of Flusser. And I thought, wow, Flusser told me, use a new technological invention or device or app. I mean, he didn't know app at the time, but later on it would be an app in a way that the inventor would not have expected. And I suddenly thought, like, wow, I could actually make an Instagram détournement, and this image sharing, platform could be used by me to share handwriting every day, to actually celebrate something which, in a way, Instagram contributes to make disappear, alongside, of course, the devices, the smartphones, which we use to use these apps. That all has to do with us using less handwriting. So it would be a double détournement, because it would be a détournement of the device on which we actually use the app, and it would be a détournement of the app itself. So I did my post of Etel writing this very beautiful poem, and as you know, I've done this, ever since. So in a way, this idea of in a way artists or thinkers giving me tasks is there, but the idea also of, with the visit with Willem Flusser, thinking of what can we do with a thinker which goes beyond the space of books. How can we actually, and that, of course, is the task in the way Édouard Glissant gave me, because I kind of came across it. We're going to talk about that later in the 80s through Boetti to Glissant. But when Glissant turned 80, his 80th anniversary, we were basically in a jazz club in Paris, because Agnes B, the amazing artist and fashion designer and philanthropist in Paris, she was friends with Glissant since the 60s, since basically she was actually at that time together with Christian Bourgois, the French publisher. And so when Agnes was in her early 20s, Christian Bourgois would introduce her to Glissant. And so she basically was very often also philanthropically supporting Glissant's idea of a museum, Glissant's institute, more than a museum, because at that time it was the institute of our world. And so she would also host his 80th anniversary. And at his 80th anniversary, it was a very crowded jazz club. Basically, Agnes V, invited friends, but Glissant invited all his friends. And Glissant told me, my friend Bantia Diawara is there. And he said, this is the opportunity for you to meet. So we were in this crowded jazz club, and Glissant took me by the hand, and he really literally pulled me through this jazz club towards Mantia, who was at the other end of the space. And he basically says, this is Mantia Diawara, this is Hans Ulrich, and I want the two of you to collaborate, for the rest of time. I want you to be friends. There is so much to do. And of course, what Glissant wanted here and what he gave us a task, he basically said, one day when I'm no longer going to be here, I want the two of you to, in a way, do things together, and it wasn't like a formal assignment. He didn't say, like, I want you to be on the board of my foundation. He didn't say, I want you to start an institution. He left it very open, what he wanted to do. And in a way, what we're discussing today, if it's the exhibition we are now having in The Hague of my Glissant archive, if it's the exhibition Asad and I co-curated initially for the Villa Empain and then for several other places. It went to several continents. It went to Australia. It went to the US. That exhibition, has a lot to do with that. And of course, Mantia has to be mentioned because Mantia Diawara was involved in all of this endeavor. And in a way, these are things which go beyond the space of the book and where we basically bring Glissant into the world differently through exhibitions. And through that also, because Glissant had an interest, he was very aware that his work was very widely studied in literary circles and in also academic circles. But at the beginning of his trajectory, when he won the Prix Renaudot for La Lézarde, and that's also something Agnès Beyer always told me, his work in the 60s was very public. He was what we could somehow call a public intellectual. And, we often discussed about the fact that today books of a certain complexity, that's also something Alain Robbe-Grillet and Nathalie Sarraute often told me, Nathalie Sarraute was my neighbor, so I had very much a connection to the Nouveau Roman, and I spoke to, Claude Simon a lot, to Nathalie Sarraute, and of course a lot to Alain Robbe-Grillet. And Robbe-Grillet often talked about this idea that, when he did the Nouveau Roman in the 60s with his friends, he also had a column, I think, in Express or in a weekly magazine, and their work was somehow radiating as public intellectuals. And he said that one could actually have things which were most advanced, most complex, yet accessible, yet in the mainstream. And of course, by the time we all met Glissant, became Glissant, books like Glissant's book would no longer be necessarily through their sort of literary channel as visible in a way and as seen as they were in the 60s and 70s. And Glissant was very interested in how we can actually find other ways in bringing ideas, complex ideas, into the world. And that's why he also, I think, started a school, because he realized actually by starting a school in Martinique, which was also a very political project, because the school was teaching Creole. And so he could actually be much more than the French schools you have in Martinique, a school which would be for everyone. Because, for example, he told me often the story that when there were hurricanes or storms on nearby islands, the pupils from these other islands would also come to Martinique and study at the school. And suddenly, through the school being Creole, it could actually bring together the pupils, the students from all the neighboring islands. And it was a very political project for Glissant to do this school, but it was also a project, it formed an entire generation, or entire generations. Patrick Chamazeau talked about that in our project. But Glissant wanted to not only do that, he also wanted to do a museum. He wanted to do a museum in Martinique. About that, I think we can also speak later. So he clearly wanted to kind of, in a way, bring his ideas into the world, through different channels. Maybe that's, in a way, the world. And that's kind of the task he gave Mantia and me, to basically, and that became a mission, because we believe, and I think that what brings us together today, that we believe that, and of course Mantia is very at the center of us of that the Glissantian toolbox is like the right to opacity, but above all also the Mondialité idea, the archipelago idea, that all these toolboxes are among the most important toolboxes for the 21st century. And that means we need to bring them into the world and as Vito Acconci has said, in a way, make them public. Anyway, so to cut the long story short, that's the road from Glissant to Flusser, and maybe also what connects us all.
Hans Ulrich's work on Glissant was already one of the inspirations for me to go further into it. And I remember reading very much the essay that Hans Ulrich wrote about Glissant for the Documenta in 2012. They put out a series of booklets. And that booklet, I think, was a real moment of a spark to me. And so a couple of years later, I was taking care of a place in Brussels called the Villa Empain, and I was there making shows, and I started a residency program where I'm actually happy to say quite a number of artists now that I see around me had come to that residency very early. For instance, Carolyn Lazard, who I was thinking of when you were talking about the détournement of the smartphone, who make this beautiful film where she keeps covering, or they keep covering the camera with the finger as a flicker film, sort of like Tony Conrad in the age of the iPhone. So anyhow, while I was doing that, I thought, well, the dream here in Brussels, because the place had a kind of motto of connecting a dialogue between East and West. I was like, well, the dream would be to do a show on Glissant and the influence and ideas of Glissant. And what was that? What would that even mean in the contemporary art context? And so we started to talk. And Hans Ulrich at the beginning was thinking maybe it could be quite a small presentation of the books, which are inscribed with Glissant's handwriting to him, which I think is a beautiful collection and could have made a beautiful small show. But I was sort of in a time wanting to be a bit ambitious, and so I kept kind of arguing that maybe we could do 2 rooms, maybe we could do 3 rooms, maybe we could do 4 rooms, maybe we could do the whole place. And eventually, Hans Ulrich agreed, I think, after coming to see the show that we did before, which was co-curated with Tino and Dorothea von Hantelmann, which was called Decor, where there was some interesting projects. And I think after that we decided let's do another full scale of the house, the Villa Empain, and we started to work. And from the very beginning, just as Hans Ulrich says, Mantia was at the center, because the first person we went to see was Mantia Diawara in New York, because he also teaches in NYU as well as living in Senegal, and originally being from Bamako in Mali. He also teaches now in Abu Dhabi. So at the time he was teaching full-time at NYU. So we went to see him in New York, and he gave us the first few kind of tasks of who to meet, who to talk to. He immediately said, you need to get Fred Moten involved. He immediately said, you need to get a number of people who did become involved. And I go back to the text that Fred Moten sent us for the first book, often, which is about Glissant and the power of reading Glissant in groups. And so Hans Ulrich and I took the advice of Fred Moten in that book, because when we eventually came to the Brisbane show, where we were doing a lot of artists from Northern Australia, many First Nations artists, and for them, Glissant is not as well known in that context. So we did a 1 year long reading group of Glissant on Zoom, and it was during the pandemic. And that experience also has left a lot of marks with me. But finally, I just wanted to say, I think that the thing that makes it really important for artists and for art, and also just in general, is that in that climate that Glissant was coming into, the intellectual climate of the 70s and 80s, there was a kind of detachment between the world and the world of ideas. So it was like you weren't actually supposed to get helped in your life by philosophy or to understand these, when Shakespeare mentions a tree, it's not a real tree. It's a signifier. It's a structuralist moment in a set of codes that are being manipulated in language, not even by Shakespeare, but by almost the discourse articulating itself through this figure. And so Glissant is impossible to read like that, because he's too specific. The images are too real. There's too much poetry in it for it to become a purely structural exercise. And that to me is really important. It's an important revision to the idea of the world that the intellectual culture of the late 20th century had, that we need to be more connected to the world itself. And I thought I hope this won't waste you guys' time too much, but I just thought, since we're here, by the way, we're here on Thursday, October 2nd, 2025, having this conversation, that maybe I could just read a few lines of Glissant so that we have the language entering our moment.
That's a beautiful idea, Asad. I love that idea.
So let me just read a little bit of Glissant. And I'll read a little bit of the poetry first. Upon your paths, what song was able to defend the clarity upon your eyes that love burned? What earth has deposited itself? Overseas is the chastity of incendiaries in books, but the fire in the real and the day is the courage of the living. They make the bird, they make the foam, and the house of lava, sometimes they make the opulence of ditches and the harvest of the past. They obey their hands, manufacturing echoes without number, and the sky and its purity flee, this purity of rock work. They make the earths that make them, the futures that spare them, or the philos exalt them upon the crests of memory. Mules, snakes, and mongooses make these men violent and gentle, and the light blinds them. The night at the edge of the colonial highways, every word is an earth whose subsoil must be searched, where a movable space is kept, burning for what the tree says. I think to have those words in the conversation is somehow helpful.
Okay, I guess we can take a breath there. Any thoughts? I don't want to think for you, but yeah, I'm always struck by the way that Glissant has this in the poetry, which is a practice of his philosophy. I wrote it in the introduction to the event that's on the website. It's like this irrepressible power that's there, that comes from history, that comes through history, that comes through his passionate reading of historic texts and his witnessing of a sort to history as a product of history. And that history is incredibly cruel and brutal. And he doesn't restrain that. He doesn't sweeten that cruelty. It's fully there in a kind of honest way, and not in a necessarily extremely threatening way. It's just the way it is. And that speaks to the legacy of colonialism that produced the Indies, that produced Martinique. Unbearably cruel, inhuman experience that is almost impossible to bear witness to or to look at historically, but yet that is our context. That is what we've all been through on one way or another. That we've all been through the process, all have experienced, whether on the side of the colonizer or on the side of the colonized, that experience of colonization. And we're all living through it. And Glissant forces us to encounter that in a very rich way, in a very deep way, something that is just fundamental to human experience. And that if we want to move towards some other outcome, some better outcome, and that's another thing that's, I guess, one of the reasons that you're all here and why you like Glissant, is that he does have, despite going all the way down, all the way deep into the abyss of what humans are capable of, he still has a kind of vision of how we could do things otherwise and have another outcome, that we can come to respect one another on equal footing, understand everybody's dignity in a radically fundamental way. Let's let them speak a little bit more.
Where can we go from there? I think maybe
I mean, one thing I thought about the show, which was interesting also, is when you said, because we had the drawings, which are also in this little book, in the blue book, we published the drawings again, and these are basically book inscriptions, but it's also a whole it's a whole series of basically sketches and drawings Glissant made about these different concepts. There is the archipelago as a passage and not a wall, of course. Then there is the tourbillon and the tremblement, the idea of trembling. Then there is, of course, the idea of a tree. The roots are profound, but never die. Then a very recurrent drawing is, of course, about the delta, and then I think very important is also the stone. I mean, almost like Nietzsche's stone in Sils Maria, but that we're going to talk later. So we had the drawings. We had then your idea to make it a bigger show. And then I remember we had a conversation where we thought it would actually be interesting to make it about Glissant's generation with whom he worked on this museum for Martinique. Because, of course, many of the artists of his basically friends with whom he had conceptualized were no longer with us, Wilfredo Lahm and Matta, but I had interviewed Matta years ago, so we had that in the archive. But there were several of his really closest friends whom we convinced to participate and who could really render and tell us about very precisely about this idea of Glissant's Institute and Glissant's Museum. And that was Antonio Segui, who now passed away, the Argentinian artist based in Paris, who always remembered that actually even he met the politicians of Martinique with Glissant to make this idea a reality. And then Valerio Adami, who is still alive, whom I actually saw again a couple of months ago, Valerio Adami, who was also very close to Glissant, and who, of course, is an important figure because he was not only close to Glissant, he was also very close to Derrida. He staged in his think tank in his sort of house where he organized salons and gatherings in Lago Maggiore. He organized in a gathering, the famous gathering between Derrida and Glissant, which is a very important archive document. So we would have these amazing, basically, témoins, these testimonies who were with Glissant. And then, of course, we wanted to bring it to a younger generation. We wanted to bring it into what we call with Schumann Bazin and Douglas Coburn the extreme present, and see how in the extreme present contemporaries today work with Glissant as a toolbox. And that's really why the show kept growing and growing. So from a small show, it suddenly became a very big show. I just wanted to add that, because it was sort of also transgenerational.
Yes, and I specifically remember how much fun it was to produce these, let's say, almost shows within a show. For instance, the rooms that were devoted to the artists of the what we called the Musée du Tout Monde, and then there was another room where we had Attel and a number of other works, Walter Price, that was also furnished so that you could spend time in it like a living room. And then downstairs there was this more large-scale presentation of the books, but with a site-specific sort of mural by Philippe Parreno, and there was a lot of touches of Ranjana von Leyendecker everywhere in the house as well. So as Hans Ulrich says, the show grew, and it did take over the house. And then I would even say that the other shows were not that show. We actually completely it was 4 different shows rather than one show that toured to 4 places. And the second one very much focused on Glissant and Lydia Cabrera from Cuba, which we did together with Gabriela Rangel. And then the third show was a kind of large-scale presentation again in Miami, and Where the Oceans Meet, which we did together with Rina Carvajal. Anyhow, it's 4 shows separately, I think, and in a way, when we do the next show, it will probably be something completely different again.
Okay, welcome, Asad. How are you?
You have to press the button just until it lights up. Yeah. Oh, it's on. It's on. Thank you. I'm fine.
Good. Okay, we have the pleasure of a double Asad now. The past, Asad from the past, has anything changed remarkably from?
I mean, that was pretty only some days ago. Nothing much has changed, but I noticed that people are thinking and talking about Glissant more and more. I was in Paris yesterday for the doing a different talk, and I was doing a talk with Donatien Grau, who is the curator of contemporary art at the Louvre, and he spent much time talking about Glissant and his interest in Glissant's ideas of the museum. So to think that in a few years, when I was an undergraduate at Johns Hopkins, Glissant was known, but was not important anywhere near the same league at that time, considered in the same league at that time as Gilles Deleuze or Derrida, etc., to now, doing a talk yesterday in Paris and seeing the curator from the Louvre speaking more about Glissant than anyone else, it tells me that things are, let's say, the prophetic character of Glissant's work has revealed itself more and more.
What do you think is appealing to people so much in Glissant's work? Like we were talking, Hans Ulrich was mentioning, and you were also mentioning, like this quality of his practice, which is also political. He's like his school in Martinique. It has a strong socially, externalized aspect. So he wanted to create this museum, for example. He's organized lots of events. So he wasn't only a writer and philosopher, kept to himself, but he was synthesizing his ideas in the public space.
Yeah, I think. I think there were any number of other activists, let's say, at that time, but I think that I think it goes a little bit deeper towards some of the central concerns that Glissant was working through and thinking about only became more and more relevant. So he was very interested in the interplay between humans and the natural world, and that has become more and more evident to be a crucial and relevant thing in the last 15 years since he's not been here. And secondly, he thought a lot about the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and other aspects of history that at that time were really not considered to be the central thrust. The central thrust of the intellectual culture of Paris or New York in 1990 or so was the history of Western civilization as a kind of as a increasingly questioned but still centralized narrative. And then the third thing I think is that Glissant had a focus on identity and the opacity of identity, which is very relevant now to people, that our identities themselves have been mined and commodified in ways that, the idea of the opacity of an individual and their identity in this age when everyone is supposed to be transparent and the government can know so much about what people are doing and saying is very relevant. So all of the issues that he was focused on, I think, ended up being more important in our time than the issues that maybe were some of the issues that were there in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, which we no longer are so worried about,
There's also that aspect that he's somehow non-confrontational in a way that he, like the concept of creolization, it affects both the people who generate the Creole and the colonizer who are affected and eventually start using the Creole themselves, or their language is transformed from the creolization. So colonization is this two-way effect and nobody's safe from it. It's also similar to Spivak in that way. And yeah, and then also this Mondialité, tout monde, everybody has their own monde. It's like a radical commitment to everybody's dignity, which can start right now in principle, right? Wherever we're coming from with all the baggage that we carry here, right? It's not like blaming and like trying to be more reparatory, which is another vector in addressing coloniality and addressing how we got to this point.
I think that's, in general, that's right, but I also think that there's a strong sense of political valence, let's say, in Glissant. So I don't know if I would completely say that everyone has their own monde as much as everything is interrelated, and he sees these interrelations quite clearly. But I think he was very clear about what he was in support of, and as a student or friend of Fanon and Césaire, he does come from a similar world, but his version of it is, I think, more poetic and less directly expressed, which is, as you say, I think I agree with that. And that's something that allows more people to be affected by his writing. But I think in general, we also we really, even when the first show that we did, which we were talking about in the video with Hans Ulrich, that show was we were preparing that show in 2016, so 10 years ago. Already this time feels so much has happened, which has even deepened the concerns that Glissant already had. And so it's quite something how you see this movement in the world today that's simultaneously extremely distressing, and then at the same time there's a kind of opposite movement happening too, which has a harder time maybe getting attention, but it feels that, for instance, like I was saying, the fact that Glissant is so much more so many more people engage with Glissant, that's interesting. There's this kind of double movement in the world today, and it's a very unpredictable, mercurial moment, maybe more so than ever.
Yeah. Well, just on the note that you were both mentioning this collection of artists and artworks that which were donated to Édouard Glissant for his project Musée du Tout Monde. Recently had its first exhibition in Sao Paulo. Sylvie Sema-Glissant will be here, who was core to the organization of that exhibition. So I don't know if she's here yet. Oh, she's there. Hello. So she will be here. She can also maybe tell us a little bit about it. And also Hamadine Khan is here, who is also there, who was a witness to the exhibition. So he will also be able to make some comments about that. Museum, which has never actually been instantiated in Martinique as it was planned, the Museum Without Walls. We have about 15 minutes left. What, do you want to watch a little bit more video, or you want to talk more, or people want to jump in? Got something to ask? How do you feel? The video will be available on the whole video will be available on West's website at a certain point in the future, near future. So you can see the whole interaction. It's an hour long, so we're obviously not going to watch all of it. We can watch a little bit more. What do people think? Yeah? Let's go back to 3 weeks ago, and then we can come back to now.
Okay.
Yeah? Okay, let's see.
And of course, the Latourian notion of the Gedankenausstellungen, the idea of a sort of a thought exhibition, no? Because I'm in a similar way, I would reach out to Glissant, at a certain moment in the later 90s, early 2000s. I also reached out to Latour, and we invited Latour to Laboratorium in Antwerpen. And he sort of said this, because at the beginning he was very reluctant as a thinker to say, he said, I'm writing books, why would I do exhibitions? But then at a certain moment he realized that actually this is not an exhibition which is representation, but it's a Gedankenausstellung, which basically can engage in complex issues and engage in public scientific, political, artistic issues. So basically that the exhibition becomes an experiment, akin to a laboratory setting, in a way, akin to a laboratory setting. And that means, in a way, Asad, as you say, that the exhibition kept evolving, kept learning. It was a learning system, in a way, a complex dynamic system with many feedback loops, and where we try to make complex issues somehow accessible and understandable through as Latour said, through sensory experience. And of course it's fascinating that Latour went on and on after the experience we had with him with Laboratorium to do these big exhibitions at ZKM, in Karlsruhe. So yeah, and it still, I think, is also interesting to keep in mind Lyotard and Les Immatériaux, where basically Lyotard spent so much time. And that's, of course, the Lyotard exhibition, Les Immatériaux, is kind of an early exhibition as a laboratory, as a knowledge-producing exhibition. Daniel Buren told me that the artists were just sent a computer, and that was before people had a computer. So technicians had to come home and explain them how to use the computer, and they kind of connected the artists in the show. It's pre-internet. I mean, Les Immatériaux was before internet, and that's, of course, Philippe Pareno was very inspired by that show, and we have had so many conversations about Les Immatériaux. So I would say that's also been in the background. I would say, outside of you and me thinking about this exhibition, a Gedankenausstellung. We wanted it to be a Glissantian Gedankenausstellung, no?
Totally. And I think that you bring up a very important point when you bring up Les Immatériaux, which is about networks, and not just networks of computer chips, but networks of people, which I always love this phrase that Monica Narula from Rux Media Collective says, which is the arboreal network of Glissantians. And I feel that by doing the shows, in a way, the show functions like a kind of wind that rustles all the leaves, that strikes again these branches to resonate with each other, of this arboreal network of Glissantians. And that also goes with my metaphor of Hans Ulrich as a gardener who tends to these gardens of cultural worlds. And so I feel like that's one value in doing the shows, is to once again sort of resonate these branches and leaves like a kind of wind blowing through that network, and to reactivate that network's sort of self-understanding and the connections between all of those figures, whether it's Mantia Diawara in Senegal, or whether Monica with the rest of Rux in India, et cetera, et cetera. That network is something, I think it's a privilege. It feels like a privilege to be part of that, and to be able to continue having those conversations. And that also reminds me of an original inspiration, which I never attended, but Hans Ulrich attended, I think, several times, which were the poetry readings that Glissant had in Paris, in which people would read in their own language, whether or not others understood, without translation. And those were a very inspiring kind of event that I think kind of, again, is a moment where this is just, rather than being theorized or didactically talked about, it's just being brought into being. The kind of mondialité that Glissant was interested, the kind of worldness or global dialogue, that he was interested in, is there, and it's there, preserving its opacity, because whether you understand or not, you're there, and you're taking something from all of these different sources. And I tried to do something slightly influenced by that in the Gropiusbau a couple of years ago, called Mangrove Sunset, where we brought many people and had them do their contributions in different languages over about 6 hours, where the sun was setting inside of the Gropiusbau through the windows, and Hans Ulrich was speaking there in Swiss German, and Mantia was speaking in dialects that he said people on the other side of Bamako would not understand, let alone people in outside of Mali. And we also had a reading by a young artist, Rundal Arabi, in Sudanese Arabic, which to my mind was I think was the most emotional moment of the 6 hours. Somehow this young artist reciting poetry in Sudanese Arabic that none of us could understand was led to this kind of a cathartic moment. So yeah, the lessons of doing Glissantian, being part of that network are many. And I also would just like to say that a couple of years, I think I never told you this, Hans Ulrich, but like in 2019, we did the conversation and you asked me the question about unrealized projects. And I told you that my unrealized project was to have a river or a stream flowing through a museum. And 3 years later, got the chance to do that. And that also was a very Glissantian. I think that idea came a lot out of this Pensée du Tremblement, the idea of the sound of the world. That idea came from. But in any case, it was interesting in the sense that it was an unrealized project that then quickly became a realized project. So I now have this sense that it's good to name these unrealized projects because then maybe that means they become realized projects.
And of course, you refer to these multilinguist evenings or celebrations, which for me are unforgettable because obviously when we do such multilinguist events where poetry or text are read in many different languages without translation, that's a reference to these evenings Édouard Glissant did in the Maison Amérique Latine, where actually at the time the father of Hugo Vitrani, who is now at the Palais de Tokyo, his father was director, and they did invited Glissant to do these evenings where you would have poets from many different languages read poetry, and we would attend and listen to languages we not necessarily would understand. It was really, it's for me, one of the strongest memories of any event, really.
This is the first time for me to comment on a video of us doing a conversation, so I'm struggling a little to get how do I enter that? But yeah, that was what we were talking about. It does strike me, though, that even these discourses like poetry, it's harder for people to have mental space to engage with them in the way that they were traditionally engaged with, because people's attention. I have a friend who has written about how a contemporary culture of attention is being fracked, which fracking is like this technique of mining of breaking up the ground, the bedrock in order to loosen shale oil and taking oil, which is quite difficult. It has a lot of impact on a lot of ecological impact. And so anyway, this friend, Graham Burnett, writes about our attention is being fracked in order to mine value from that. And I feel that just spending time with poetry or with one of Glissant's essays, for instance, like the ones in Poetics of Relation, that's also a good thing for your brain to do now, because you are forced to kind of get back to a different delivery system, which required you to have a little bit more sustained attention, and which doesn't immediately have a kind of doesn't immediately deliver a payoff. And so poetry, when you're just reading poetry now, feels much more radical and in a way much more necessary than reading explanatory material. So I think that, I guess since we're doing the symposium, that would be something to me to really recommend people to do. For instance, you could take A Field of Islands or another poem of Glissant, spend time with it, because it's difficult, but this also is sort of a good training for our brains that have been fracked.
Yeah. Oh, we have some comments. Hold on. I think somebody's coming. Yeah, Chloe will come with the microphone. Without microphone? It's good for the posterity, for the record, yeah.
No, I was just, yeah, some cues from the video and your conversation. So you were talking with the director of the Louvre, then we heard about poetry reading, so I was imagining a poetry reading in the Louvre, maybe Glissant, in connection with the paintings, specific paintings, how to open up the museum space to a more political conversation. So that, would that be possible? Like, I don't know, poetry reading at the Louvre. That's my idea.
Do you have some clout with the director of the Louvre? I mean, what did you end up discussing? Did you discuss something concrete over there?
Well, I think you should stage a poetry reading at the Louvre, actually. That sounds fun. And maybe it could be a poetry reading where poets read in their own languages. But I unfortunately don't have any ability to necessarily make that happen. But if they happen to call me, I will tell them your idea, and maybe they can get in touch with you, or I can help you do it. I think that these kind of, later today there's going to be a performance by Nikima Yagudayev, who I've worked with several times, and I think in Nikima's work you see this like a kind of coexistence of different ways of being in a space that sort of breaks down the barrier between the audience and the people who are supposed to be kind of presenting something in many ways, and also produces a very fluid situation in the room, using choreography, using music, using food. And so I just think of that as an example. When you say to do a poetry reading in the Louvre, then I also think, to do something like Nikima's work, which is going to happen here, which is great, is something good, because all of these, I think that's something Glissant had kept his focus, that all of these fields, the field itself is not important. It's much more important the effect and the kind of engagement that you give things, and the way that they help you in a way own yourself. And so there's something in that sense that's not very scholastic about his work that I like, and that kind of encourages you to be the important person now in the present.
Okay, we have time for one more comment. Yep. Oh, wait.
I don't know if I need that. Maybe I do. Hello. Thank you for the conversation. I was missing one word in a way that I'm thinking about all the time, and that is the word obscurity. So there's opacity, the idea that you don't really need to understand or explain, and then I hear all the time the idea of visibility, so making the books of Glissant, for instance, more visible. But at the same, and transparency, something that we don't like. People have to be more transparent than they want to be. But then at the same time, I feel that, like also the book itself is closed, or not everything is visible. And there's also something, that I am thinking about, like obscurity. And I'm not really familiar with Glissant's work, but I would like to. Maybe you have some thoughts about that word. I mean, maybe it's
It sounds very, very close to opacity. because obscurity is dark, and if you cannot see in, wait.
But it's not visible. So opacity is visible, and obscurity means it's not visible. It's hidden. It's not. There's no attention for it. So opacity is you put it somewhere on a stage, and then you see it, but you don't need to make it transparent. But there are also so many things that are made obscure, or they are obscure, and I don't know. I feel related to obscurity, so maybe that is why I mentioned that word.
There's some things that cannot be addressed, no matter how hard we try, and always the words will be insufficient, and the means will be insufficient. We have like a couple of minutes, Asad, because we have to move on to another, maybe addressing of obscurity and opacity in a way with Sophie Borel's second performance. But Asad, do you want to?
I hadn't thought about that connection before, and it's interesting to think about the difference between obscurity and opacity. I also think obscurity often is used to refer to people or to things that are happening that humans do that are hidden from view. So it makes me think, for instance, of the novel Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, which was a novel about, the idea of the novel is that there's a person who never gets the chance to be seen, who never gets the chance to be appreciated, who never gets the chance to become into the light because they were born in the wrong place, in the wrong class, in the wrong time. And it's a very tragic novel. And it also made me think about, there's an essay which I would recommend you to read, if you haven't, called The Open Boat, which is by Glissant. And in The Open Boat, he talks about the sea and the invisible, what he calls, I think, punctuation marks, which are like circles and dots and commas formed by the chains of enslaved people who were thrown overboard on the Middle Passage, and how the Middle Passage is marked by these shackles and chains on the bottom of the sea, which we cannot see. And that's the kind of image which I think he can produce, which you can't forget once you know the image, and you can't see things quite the same way. But that's a moment where he thinks about what it means, what is being obscured, what is obscured, and how to produce images for that.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you to those who dared to ask a question and intervene. We will switch the stage and again back to the performance mode for Sophie Borel's second part of the Indies, Les Indes, and then we will go to lunch. Thank you, Asad.